I was standing on my front lawn, the sun barely dropping behind the houses, when a woman I had never met marched up my driveway and pointed straight at the American flag hanging from my porch. Without even introducing herself, she said, "That violates community standards. You have 48 hours to take it down, or you'll be fined." I actually laughed because I thought she had to be kidding. That flag had been there since the very first day I moved into Pine Hollow Ridge, a quiet little neighborhood just outside Briarfield County, Ohio. It was clean, respectful, and mounted exactly the way it was supposed to be. But this woman didn't smile back. She stood there gripping a clipboard like it gave her authority, then finally introduced herself as Linda Hargreeve, head of the HOA Compliance Committee. She told me my flag was political, provocative, and somehow a threat to neighborhood harmony. I stopped laughing when she handed me the letter. $100 per day, every day. That was when it hit me. This wasn't about a rule. It wasn't about a flag. This was about power. And Linda had no idea she had just picked the wrong homeowner. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I had moved into Pine Hollow Ridge a little over 3 years earlier, fresh off a divorce that had drained just about every ounce of energy I had. All I wanted at that point in my life was quiet, no drama, no arguments, just a place where I could come home after work, sit on my porch, and breathe. The brochures for the neighborhood sold exactly that: tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors, and what they called a respectful community culture. It sounded perfect. What those brochures didn't mention was the HOA's unhealthy obsession with control. At first, it was easy to ignore. A friendly-looking notice taped to my door saying my trash can had been visible for 1 extra hour past pickup time. Another letter a few weeks later suggesting my lawn could be more evenly maintained, even though it was already cut and green. Annoying, sure, but nothing that felt worth pushing back on. I told myself that was just the cost of living in a neighborhood with an HOA. The flag was different. That flag wasn't decoration to me. It wasn't political. It wasn't some statement meant to provoke anyone. My father had served in the Army. He passed away a few years before I moved into Pine Hollow Ridge, and losing him still felt fresh most days. My grandfather had served too. Growing up, that flag had always been part of our family, folded carefully, raised on holidays, treated with respect. Hanging it on my porch was my way of carrying that history forward, of feeling connected to them and to the idea of home. So when the violation notice showed up in my mailbox, I read it 3 times just to make sure I wasn't missing something. It didn't even mention the word flag. Instead, it cited an obscure clause about unauthorized exterior displays deemed disruptive to community aesthetics. No definition. No examples. Just vague language that could mean almost anything if someone wanted it to. At the bottom was a warning about fines beginning after 48 hours. That was when I decided to handle it the adult way. I showed up to the next HOA meeting determined to stay calm. I wasn't looking for a fight. I figured this had to be some misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a simple conversation. The meeting room was a bland space in the community center, rows of folding chairs facing a long table where the board sat. Linda was right in the middle, pen tapping against a clipboard as if she were already annoyed someone had the nerve to question her. When it was my turn to speak, I explained everything. I talked about my father, about my grandfather, about why that flag mattered to me. I explained that it had been properly mounted, well maintained, and that federal law protected a homeowner's right to display it. I even brought printed copies of the statute, highlighted and neatly organized. Linda didn't look at a single page. She leaned back in her chair, smiled tightly, and said, "We understand your feelings, but our community rules are stricter than federal guidelines." The room went quiet. That sentence hit me harder than the fine notice ever could. It wasn't just dismissive, it was arrogant. In that moment, I realized this wasn't about community standards or harmony. It was about who got to decide what was acceptable and who didn't. I sat back down knowing one thing for sure. Reason wasn't going to fix this. Within a week, the fines started piling up faster than I could believe. $100 per day at first. Then another notice arrived saying the amount would increase if I didn't comply immediately. Every email from the HOA had the word urgent stamped across the subject line, like I was some kind of criminal instead of a homeowner with a flag on his porch. A few notices were even taped directly to my front door, bright paper meant to be seen by anyone who walked past. That was when the neighborhood began to feel different. People I used to wave at suddenly looked away. A couple of neighbors who used to stop and chat at the mailbox kept their heads down and hurried inside. I could feel the tension without anyone saying a word. Linda had made it clear that I was now the problem, and nobody wanted to get pulled into it. Then the inspection started. Linda showed up unannounced one afternoon with her clipboard and her phone. She didn't knock. She didn't say hello. She walked straight up my driveway and started taking pictures of my porch from every angle. She measured the flagpole with a small tape measure she pulled from her pocket, muttering under her breath like she was documenting a crime scene. A day later, I received another notice. This time, she claimed the angle of the flag mount was incorrect. The next notice said the fabric moved too freely in the wind, which supposedly made it distracting. It was absurd. Flags are supposed to move in the wind. That is literally the point. But logic didn't matter anymore. Every excuse felt more ridiculous than the last, yet each one came with another fine attached. I still tried to keep things civil. I sent emails offering to adjust the mount. I said I would replace the bracket if that somehow made them feel better. I attached federal statutes explaining exactly why what they were doing wasn't allowed. I highlighted the sections, just like I had at the meeting, hoping someone on the board would finally read them. Linda responded with one sentence. The compliance decision stands. No explanation, no discussion. Just power. A few days later, the envelope arrived that made my stomach drop. Lien proceedings. According to the letter, if the fines continued to go unpaid, the HOA reserved the right to place a lien on my home. My home. The place I had rebuilt my life in after everything fell apart. All because I refused to take down a flag that meant more to me than they could ever understand. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table long after dinner had gone cold. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your thoughts louder. Through the window, I could see the flag on the porch, gently moving in the breeze under the porch light. It looked peaceful, normal, like it always had. I kept asking myself how it had come to this. How did something so simple turn into a financial threat hanging over my head? How did one person get the authority to decide that my family's history was disruptive? I felt angry, sure, but underneath that was something worse. Uncertainty. Anxiety. The kind that makes you wonder how far someone is willing to go just to prove they're in control. For the first time since this started, I felt genuinely stuck. Then I picked up my phone. I scrolled past missed calls and HOA emails and stopped on a name I hadn't called in a while. My brother. As soon as he answered, I didn't even know where to start. I just said, "You're not going to believe what my HOA is doing." He listened quietly while I explained everything. The fines, the inspections, the threats. I could hear his breathing change as I talked, slow at first, then sharper. When I finished, there was a brief pause. Then he said, "They did what?" That was the moment I realized I wasn't alone in this anymore. Mark stayed quiet while I finished explaining everything, which wasn't like him at all. Usually he jumped in with advice or questions, but this time he just listened. When I finally stopped talking, there was a short pause on the line. Then he let out a small laugh. Not mocking, not amused. It was the kind of laugh someone makes when they already know how this story ends. "Let me get this straight," he said. "This HOA woman thinks she can override federal protections for the American flag?" I told him yes. that she had said their community rules were stricter than federal law. There was another pause, longer this time. "You remember what I do, right?" he asked. Of course I did, but the way he said it made me hesitate. Mark wasn't just my older brother. He was a veteran, had been for years. What I hadn't fully connected in that moment was how far his involvement went. "I run the local Veterans of Foreign Wars post," he continued. "I'm the commander." That was the exact moment the weight on my chest shifted. Mark explained things calmly, breaking it down in a way that made everything suddenly clear. Federal law didn't just loosely protect the right to display the American flag. It very clearly did. HOAs could regulate things like size or placement in some limited cases, but they could not ban it outright, fine someone for it, or harass a homeowner into removing it. And once they had been informed of those protections, continuing to enforce fines crossed from ignorance into willful violation. That's where it gets dangerous for them, Mark said. Especially if it looks like selective enforcement. He told me stories I hadn't heard before. Other veterans. Other neighborhoods. Similar situations where HOAs tried to flex authority they didn't actually have. In most of those cases, the HOA backed down the moment they realized who they were dealing with. The ones that didn't ended up paying for it, legally and financially. I asked him what I should do next. "First," he said, "stop responding to Linda directly. Everything from this point on needs to be documented. Second, you're not going back to that next meeting alone." I told him I didn't want to drag him into it. He cut me off. "This isn't just about you," he said. "This is about a pattern. If they're doing this to you, they've done it to others, or they will." Then he made an offer that changed everything. He said he would attend the next HOA meeting with me, not as my brother sitting quietly in the back, but officially as Commander Mark Reynolds of Veterans of Foreign Wars Post 742. He explained that the VFW had legal resources, advocacy channels, and a lot more visibility than an HOA board in a small neighborhood ever expected to deal with. He also explained that once the issue was raised formally, it wouldn't just be a private dispute anymore. It would be a matter of public record and public accountability. I hung up the phone feeling something I hadn't felt since this started. Relief. For the first time, I wasn't reacting anymore. I had a plan. I had support. And most importantly, I had someone on my side who knew exactly how to push back the right way. Linda had no idea what was coming. And neither did the rest of the board. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the atmosphere felt completely different. I knew something was up the moment I pulled into the parking lot and saw cars lined along the curb. Normally, these meetings barely drew a handful of residents. This time, the room was packed. Neighbors I'd never seen at a meeting before filled the chairs, standing along the walls when seats ran out. Word had spread fast, even if no one admitted exactly how. Mark arrived with me, calm as ever. He wasn't trying to make a scene. He wore his VFW uniform, clean and pressed, not flashy or dramatic, just unmistakably official. A few people noticed immediately. Whispers started before we even sat down. Someone behind me leaned over and quietly asked, "Is that a veteran officer?" I didn't answer, but Mark gave a polite nod. Linda noticed too. She froze for half a second when she saw him, then quickly plastered on that same tight smile she always wore. She called the meeting to order, tapping her pen against the table like she was trying to convince herself she was still in charge. Her voice was steady at first, but I could hear the tension underneath it. She started with routine announcements, dragging them out longer than usual, but she was hoping whatever had everyone buzzing would just disappear. It didn't. The moment she opened the floor for homeowner concerns, Mark stood up. The room went silent. He introduced himself calmly, clearly, and without a hint of aggression. He stated his name, his role as Commander of Veterans of Foreign Wars Post 742, and why he was there. No theatrics. No raised voice. Just authority backed by confidence. Then he began to speak about the law. He read the federal protections for displaying the American flag out loud, slowly and deliberately, so there was no confusion. He explained exactly what homeowners associations could regulate and, more importantly, what they could not. He cited real cases where HOAs had been fined or sued for doing exactly what Pine Hollow Ridge was attempting. He explained enforcement limits, how selective enforcement was a serious violation, and how harassment through repeated fines could escalate into legal consequences. As he spoke, I watched Linda. Her smile faded almost immediately. Her pen stopped tapping. She glanced down at her paperwork, then back up at Mark, then at the other board members. It was the first time I had ever seen her look unsure of herself. Mark didn't stop there. He paused, looked around the room, and said something that shifted the entire meeting. He explained that my situation was not unique. Over the past few years, he said, multiple veterans living in the same neighborhood had reached out privately to the VFW with similar complaints. Threats, warnings, pressure to remove flags, or military displays. Most of them had backed down quietly, not because they were wrong, but because they didn't want trouble. They didn't want to be singled out. They didn't want to fight their own neighbors. Until now, you could feel the energy in the room change. People started murmuring. A man in the second row raised his hand and said his brother had gone through the same thing 2 streets over. A woman near the back nodded and said her husband had taken down his flag after getting a warning letter years ago. Another neighbor spoke up about receiving a notice but being too intimidated to challenge it. Linda tried to interrupt. Mark held up a hand, not aggressively, just enough to signal he wasn't finished. He made it clear that continuing enforcement after being informed of federal protections could expose the HOA to serious consequences. Legal fees, penalties, public scrutiny. He emphasized that this wasn't about attacking the neighborhood, but about stopping a pattern of overreach before it caused real damage. The board members started shifting in their seats. One of them leaned over and whispered something to another. I could tell this was not how they expected the night to go. Linda finally spoke, her voice sharper than before. She claimed the HOA attorney had approved the actions. Mark calmly asked for that approval in writing. There was none. Silence filled the room again, heavier this time. That was when I realized something important. This meeting was no longer about me or my flag. It had become about accountability. About whether the HOA could continue operating unchecked or whether the people living here were finally going to push back. As I looked around at my neighbors, I saw something I hadn't seen since moving in. People weren't afraid anymore, and Linda knew it. Linda cleared her throat and straightened the stack of papers in front of her, the universal signal that she was trying to regain control of the room. Her voice sharpened as she spoke, louder than before, like volume alone could put the situation back in her favor. These actions were taken with legal guidance, she said. Our HOA attorney approved the fines and the enforcement process. Mark didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at her and asked one calm question. Can you provide that approval in writing? The room held its breath. Linda blinked, then glanced to her left, where the other board members sat. She shuffled through her papers, flipped a page, then another. The seconds stretched. Finally, she said something about the attorney being unavailable and the documentation being on file. Mark nodded once. Then we can review it when it's produced. It was a small moment, but it cracked everything open. One of the board members, a man who had barely spoken during any meeting I had attended before, leaned forward. He cleared his throat and said he hadn't personally seen any written approval. Another board member followed, admitting she had assumed Linda had handled it properly and hadn't asked for documentation either. The murmurs in the room grew louder. That was when Mark asked if the board would allow homeowners to share relevant communications. Linda hesitated, then reluctantly agreed, clearly believing she could still contain the situation. She was wrong. A neighbor stood up and read an email he had received years earlier, threatening fines for a military flag displayed in his garage window. Another woman pulled up a message on her phone and read a warning about a memorial plaque on her lawn. Each story sounded painfully familiar. Vague rules, immediate threats, no clear appeals process. Then someone mentioned selective enforcement. Emails were read aloud comparing violations. Similar displays ignored on some homes while others were targeted. The pattern became impossible to deny. Every example pointed back to the same source of authority. Linda. As the tension mounted, another board member hesitantly mentioned something else. He said he felt uncomfortable bringing it up, but since the topic was enforcement consistency, it seemed relevant. He quietly pointed out that Linda herself had several violations on record that had never been addressed. An oversized shed, decorative lighting that exceeded allowed brightness, a yard sign that had stayed up well past the permitted time frame. The room went dead silent. Linda's face flushed. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. For the first time since I'd met her, she didn't seem sure what to say. The board members exchanged looks. Neighbors whispered to one another, disbelief spreading through the room. Someone near the back let out a short laugh before quickly covering their mouth. Linda abruptly called for a recess. People stood up, conversations breaking out immediately. Small groups formed. Whispers turned into quiet but excited discussions. I overheard neighbors talking about filing complaints, about demanding transparency, about how long this behavior had been going on. I stayed seated, watching Linda gather her things with stiff, mechanical movements. She avoided eye contact, staring straight ahead, as if focusing on some invisible point on the wall. For the first time since this ordeal began, she didn't look confident. She didn't look powerful, she looked cornered. And everyone in that room could see it. The recess didn't last long, but it felt heavy. People stayed in their seats this time, talking in low voices, waiting. Linda returned to the table with her posture stiff, arms crossed, jaw set like she had already decided how this was going to end. Then the door at the back of the room opened. A man in a wrinkled suit hurried in, clearly out of breath. He scanned the room like he was already behind and knew it. Someone near me whispered, "That's the HOA attorney, he was late." And he knew it. Linda immediately stood up and said his name sharply, as if scolding him for showing up at all. He nodded once, mumbled an apology, and asked what he had missed. One of the board members handed him the stack of documents Mark had brought, along with printed emails, copies of the fines, and highlighted sections of federal law. The attorney flipped through the pages. At first, his expression was neutral. Then his brow furrowed. He stopped flipping and actually started reading. The room was silent except for the sound of paper. After a long moment, he looked up and said something that changed everything. "I strongly advise the board to suspend all fines related to this matter immediately." A wave of murmurs swept through the room. I felt my shoulders drop for the first time in weeks. Linda shot to her feet. "That is not necessary," she snapped. "These fines were issued under my authority as head of compliance. We are enforcing community standards." The attorney turned to her slowly. "And that," he said evenly, "is the problem." Linda tried to interrupt him, but he kept going. He explained, clearly and publicly, that there was no written authorization from legal counsel approving the fines. He explained that federal protections regarding the American flag were not optional guidelines. He explained that continuing enforcement after being notified could expose the HOA to lawsuits, financial penalties, and serious reputational damage. Linda's face turned red. She argued louder now, saying she was only doing her job, that she was protecting the neighborhood, that rules were rules. Every word just dug the hole deeper. The attorney finally raised his voice, not angry, just firm. "You acted without board approval and without legal clearance," he said. "You exposed this association to unnecessary risk." The room went completely still. He went on to say that selective enforcement, if proven, would make the HOA's position even worse. He emphasized that homeowners had documentation, witnesses, and a clear pattern. This was no longer something that could be brushed aside quietly. Linda looked around, searching for support. She didn't find it. One of the board members cleared his throat and said the board needed to discuss leadership and process immediately. Another nodded and said trust had clearly been broken. A third said homeowners deserved accountability. Then the motion was made, a vote. Linda protested loudly, accusing the board of undermining her, of letting emotions run the meeting. The attorney said nothing this time. He didn't need to. The vote was taken right there, in front of everyone. Hands went up. When the count was finished, the result was clear. Linda was removed from the compliance committee effective immediately. For a second, there was silence. Then applause broke out. It wasn't polite applause. It was real, relieved, emotional. People stood. Some clapped loudly, others wiped their eyes. A few veterans nodded quietly at one another. I felt something tighten in my chest, then release. Linda stood frozen, staring at the table like she couldn't quite process what had just happened. She gathered her papers slowly, hands shaking, and walked out without saying another word. As the door closed behind her, the attorney addressed the room again. He confirmed the fines were suspended and would be reviewed for cancellation. He recommended immediate policy revisions and promised formal follow-up, but I barely heard him. All I could think was this: the power she had wielded so easily was gone, and it had collapsed the moment people stopped being afraid. The days after that meeting felt strangely quiet, like the neighborhood itself was exhaling. For the first time since this all started, my phone wasn't buzzing with urgent emails or new notices taped to my door. A week later, an official letter from the HOA arrived in my mailbox. I opened it slowly, half expecting some new angle or loophole. Instead, it was exactly what it should have been all along. The letter confirmed that every fine issued against my home had been fully rescinded. Not reduced, not paused. Completely erased. It stated that the enforcement actions had been taken improperly and that no further penalties related to the flag would be pursued. Reading those words felt surreal. Weeks of stress, anger, and uncertainty disappeared in a single paragraph. A few days after that, another letter followed. This one was addressed not just to me, but to the entire neighborhood. It was a formal written apology from the HOA board, carefully worded but unmistakable in its meaning. They acknowledged that residents had been subjected to inconsistent enforcement, that certain actions had overstepped legal boundaries, and that the board was committed to rebuilding trust with the community. That commitment didn't stay on paper. At the next meeting, the board introduced amendments to the HOA rules. The language was clear and specific this time. American flags and military service displays were explicitly protected. No vague clauses. No room for interpretation. The rule stated that homeowners had the right to display them respectfully, without fear of fines, harassment, or retaliation. The room erupted in approval. What surprised me most was how many people came up to talk to me afterward. Neighbors I barely knew thanked me for standing up. Veterans shared stories they had kept to themselves for years. One man admitted he had folded up his flag and put it in his garage after receiving a warning, believing he had no choice. He told me he planned to hang it back up that weekend. And he wasn't the only one. Over the next few weeks, more flags appeared throughout Pine Hollow Ridge. Porches that had once looked identical suddenly reflected the people living there. It wasn't loud or showy. It was personal, respectful, real. Linda kept a low profile after her removal. She stopped attending meetings altogether. When she did appear outside, she avoided conversations and stayed inside most of the time. 6 months later, a for sale sign went up in her yard. The house sold quickly. When the moving truck pulled away, nobody cheered. Nobody needed to. The chapter was simply over. The neighborhood felt different after that. Lighter. People waved again. Conversations returned to normal things. Weather, kids, weekend plans. The HOA meetings became shorter, quieter, and surprisingly productive. The board started listening instead of dictating. As for me, life returned to what I had wanted in the first place: peace. Some mornings I sit on my porch with a cup of coffee and watch the flag move gently in the breeze. It's the same flag, the same mount, the same spot it's always been in. But now, it feels heavier with meaning. Not because it caused a fight, but because it survived one. And it still flies. When I look back on everything that happened, I realize it was never really about a flag. The flag was just the excuse. What it was really about was power, and what happens when someone thinks they can bully others into silence simply because they hold a title or a clipboard. This experience taught me something I won't ever forget. Knowing your rights matters, yes. But knowing who stands with you matters even more. On my own, I was stressed, anxious, and constantly second-guessing myself. The moment others stepped forward, my brother, my neighbors, people who had been quietly dealing with the same pressure, everything changed. What surprised me most was how many people had been waiting for someone to speak up. All it took was one challenge to remind everyone that this was our neighborhood, not a handful of people's personal rule book. Watching neighbors regain their confidence, hang their flags back up, and stop living in fear of fines was more satisfying than any apology letter could ever be. Now, every time I sit on my porch and see that flag moving in the breeze, I think of my dad and the values he passed down. I think of my brother standing beside me when it mattered most. And I think of a neighborhood that learned what happens when people stop being afraid. And that always makes me smile. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?